One of the things that we had done, I think incorrectly in our modernism, was to remove we living from the dead and or the dying.
We do not thrive in isolation.
It is the community and cooperation between people that makes meaning in life.
It was taking care of my father. And in the middle of laying my father to rest, I just started to write for myself. And that was the beginning. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have an outline. I didn't have a reason. Deep down, I just had to do this. On the internet, everyone's famous for having the answers. It's really about the questions.
True confidence is living in uncertainty.
Perfection is 100% tax. If you reach that state, then what? There's nothing left.
We're all connected across time and space. The past, present, and future make up their now.
You can imagine this no longer as a line, but as a circle. We don't necessarily know when we're going to arrive and when we depart.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops. Today's guest is one that I have followed closely after discovering him online. My guest today is Edward Rooster, who is an amazingly gifted writer, in my opinion. Edward wrote two novels entirely in public, the first called Box of Stars, the second Harvest, and he posted this live on his Substack and Twitter. Kind of half history, half myth, past, future. What does it teach us about the future? Can we imagine the future? Edward, you're currently working on a third novel called Retrieve. And I find your writing to be quite beautiful in a very lyrical, poetic sense. I mean, almost like a pastiche or a collage, the way you weave things together. And let's start out, if you don't mind, with the story The Day Dad Started Over, or The Day Dad Started Off. Which one is it, Edward?
Oh, the days Dad started. And thank you, by the way, for mentioning Dad. I do appreciate that. Very kind of you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. You say that it's the reason you're reading this. You say in the past, I gave in to doubt, fear, concern about what others think, to every handmaiden of regret. What changed?
Oh, well, it was, I would say it was taking care of my father. It was those almost 2.5 years before he passed away on January the 12th, 2021, that changed everything for me. It just changed everything for me. It ripped away all those kinds of fears and conceits that I had. And when I joined this writing group, I didn't know what I was going to do with myself or with the writing, but I knew I needed something to do with something, anything. And I gravitated towards this experimental group that was started where they wanted to encourage people to write online. And I just started writing. And in the middle of laying my father to rest, I just started to write for myself without talking about Dad at the time. I found out that some of the pieces that resonated the most with people were the ones where I was really thinking of him and feeling all these things about Dad and remembering everything. When people wrote to me about one piece that I wrote, this piece I wrote called Love is Not a Single Player Game.
Mm.
The response was gratifying. There are people who said to me that a few very kind souls said, this was very comforting to read. I can go to sleep. I can get some rest. This is something they read, a bedtime piece of writing. I didn't talk about that once. I was just talking about love and about life and about life cycle and about things you are a master of in your own life. At that moment, I said, I'll stick around. I'll write again. I wrote about the nature of time and space. And someone reached out to me in private in the same writing group in another cohort. And he sent me a video. He said, I want you to write a book. I want you to do this. And it was the kindest, most generous thing I was so touched that someone took the time and they knew my story because I said a little bit about myself in private back then. And that's when I began in the third cohort. Over the course of 6 30-day periods, I would write nonstop. What became that book, Box of Stars? I had not planned on it. I had not outlined it. I simply said, I'm going to start writing. And I decided, let's start with the first 30 days. And I created what turned out to be the outline of the book in those first 30 days. And I wanted to explore it. And at the same time, I wanted to experiment. That was what changed. It was just taking care of my father and seeing him in decline. And it was a nonstop period. It was just in the middle of COVID, which was kind of like on the outside. It was almost in the background for me and my mother and my family. All this was going on, and we did not know why he was in decline, but he was in decline. We found it after the fact that there was something growing in his brain. And I thought I thought I could help him recover and come back. And I fa- well, I was going to say failed. We couldn't do it. I tried. We tried. And we took care of him in the house after the hospital visit and an attempt at rehab. We got him out at the last minute from a rehab facility because they were going to shut down everything in March 2020. That was the last day. It was like the last helicopter out. And I took care of him in the house. We tore down a wall for a bathroom. We learned how to use a transport chair. I took care of him. We ordered a bed, everything. I learned how to do everything, and we needed to. And it was just me, mom, and him, and the outside world was the outside and was quiet and was just as well. I had no other concerns or thoughts. And he grew sick twice in that summer in August and then in the winter. And in winter was very tough because there were a lot of visitation rules that were very harsh. It was just me and him. And a lot of indignities were visited upon him by life. He got a stroke. He caught COVID in the hospital in his last weeks of life. And when we got him at the hospice, because they finally transported him to hospice there, I just kissed his forehead goodbye. We were called in, and within an hour of being called in, being in front of him, he had passed away. And I still remember his forehead was so warm. The sun, his last sunset, his last sunrise warmed him. That was it. So a few weeks later, I was in this writing group, and when we laid him to rest, I just sat down and I wrote that piece. I remember that day when it happened, and I just didn't know what to do with myself. And I just saw something on television, and it just sparked something. And I said, I'm going to write something. I'm not going to tell anything about Dad. I'm just going to write. And that was the beginning. And I just kept going because it was something I could do. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have an outline. I didn't have a reason. I just said, I'm going to do this. Somewhere deep down, I just had to do this. I did not have an articulated uh, thought as to why. I just simply had to. And that's how the book was born. It was just born that year, then the following year in 2021, while I was just dealing with everything else, dealing with his affairs and settling things. And this book and it was just about the past, about history, mythology, all these things I was exploring and thinking about. But it was also about the future. I decided to write a story about the future, and I realized that the characters I created were drawn from me. They were drawn from my experiences. And when my cohort began to read along, some of them were very kind. They spent the time to follow along for 30 days straight. And for some of them, it was very emotional. They could see and read and feel things in these words. And I thought I'd come back again. I thought that was it. But I came back because I said, this is not the end. I want to know more about these people I created in this 30-day story. I wanted to create a backstory, and I wanted to explore history. So each of these subsequent 30-day periods for the next 5 cohorts were time periods. So the first one was called 2x21 because I said, let's set it in the future. I don't know what century. And I also felt like 2021 was a big X, a big mystery, a big question mark for me. And I began to explore through these characters. I would focus on one at a time in the subsequent 5 30-day periods. Some aspect, I guess, of myself and my memories of my father, my life. And so I wrote a series called 1648. I wanted to explore the Dutch, the golden age of ledgers, I called it. I wanted to explore the mass market for art because I was watching everyone go crazy over crypto art. and about the new wealth. And I thought, well, there's an analogy there going back in time. The stack of things that emerged from the Renaissance was now being implemented. The double entry ledger, the ships that could travel over the world, mass ownership of art. I thought I saw the parallels in what was going on around us at the time in 2021. We've got the blockchain ledger instead of a double entry ledger. We've got all these things going on. So let's explore that plus a character of an artist, a young woman from a faraway place. And I made her basically from the New World, from a Jovian. I said, let's see what happens if we can turn this into a Hollywood story, because she was a minor character in the first arc, but she became important at the end. I said, let's explore the backstory. And so I did this over and over again in subsequent series. One of which I hope you'll appreciate. There was 1961 where I wrote about the Cold War, the very history of the world, the secret war that was taking place after the end of a protracted forever war, which is World War I and II. Because to me, that's one big war with a period of quiet in between, really, an unresolved conflict in between that was finally resolved and then was transmuted into something very strange and new. And it was great because there were people in the cohort who wanted to help out. So I said, there's an old declassified CIA document. I wanted to create a template for the essays. Those, at the time they were using Figma templates to write on. So I said, let's do that. Let's have some fun with this. So they created these CIA-looking documents that I could write into to post online every day for 30 days. And I would repeat this experiment over and over. In 1987, I created what looked like brokerage statements because I wanted to write about the big 80s and money and that period and the economics and what was going on in the market at that time. And explore another character, a war veteran who transforms her life and becomes the founder of a cooperative. Because I was looking at the DAOs and I was looking at corporations that, okay, what will the business structure of the future be? And what will happen? How will people reinvent themselves after a long forever war? So I said, let's create a character who I named after the names of all the mistresses of Picasso, just to make her name interesting. Fernanda Maria Therese Roque. And she was my favorite character because she was an almost incidental character. And I just dived into her backstory of a working class hero made good who ran away to the military to hide from her organized crime roots and became this entertainer, promoter, but also a mentor to that young woman, that young artist in the prior series. And I went on and on. 1999, I called it the Great Decentralization, the end of the Cold War, the end of the secret war. And I wanted to explore what happens to a war hero who has to deal with coming from Mars to Earth as a military attaché to start his life over. And just like we would have to face in the world after the Cold War had supposedly ended and there was this peace dividend being spent. And then near the end, I finished off with a series called 1976, to the very origin of the story of it was the time of Microsoft and Apple in their infancy. It was the time of Genentech in its infancy. It was the time of the first experiments would become the internet, the very first test of sending a message from California to New York. It was such an interesting period of time that no one talks about, but that was an interesting year. It was the year of the Viking landers on Mars. It was the year of David Bowie, so I called it 1976 Golden Years. And I wrote about a scientist who was the catalyst for the entire story arc, who comes upon a discovery. He's kind of like a guy who's good enough for Bell Labs, but he gets kicked out of school. He's kind of like the founders you and I read about that David Senra talks about at length in his magisterial podcast. And so that was the storyline. I tied it all together, and that was Box of Stars. And I'm not doing it justice, and I'm boring your audience, but I'm telling you that was my year, the first year, and I thought I was done. And I spoke to a good friend, Jawad Mian, who referred me to, who's the author of Street Reflections, the founder of Street Reflections, and he forwarded me to an editor friend, and I talked about it. But I still had to deal with a house that my father owned. I had to sell it, and he didn't own it all. Some relatives I hadn't seen in years owned a part of it. So I said, I can't go with the burden of dealing with an editor right now or doing that work. But I decided to escape from the stress of selling this house and all the tenants and all this stuff. Well, let me write a second book. So that became the basis of writing the second book. which was now put on the TypeShare platform. The first book was put on Twitter. It was assembled on Notion. Most of those series have a Spotify playlist key to the time period. So you hear spy music in 1961, you hear 80s music in 1987, you hear all these things. So there's Spotify playlists out there for people. And I repeated the experiment on TypeShare, which is a new writing platform, to test that out. And I wrote in 4 cohorts, I wrote another book. And this time I said, in my mind, as I was talking to the editor, I said, I have to write a book. I can't work on this editing. And all I heard was JFK's speech in 1962 in Rice University, Texas. We choose to go. And I said, this line kept reverberating in my mind. I said, I'm going to write a story. And I'm going to start it in 1962 and leap ahead 150 years to a fictional town, Heavyville, Texas, which would be this kind of company industrial town where they launched rockets. And it was overseen by something called the Space Cooperative, which is kind of like what happens to corporations. They merge into some other corporation. You've seen this. So that'll happen to the space industry probably in 100, 150 years. They'll merge into something new. And I thought, in that conglomerate, they'll face some new tests. And I made it like a disaster story. It's set on Earth because there's a Cat 7 hurricane on their way. But at the same time, I thought, let's look through the history books. There was an interesting event that happened in the 19th century called the Carrington event. It was a coronal mass ejection. I thought, let's play with that and say it's going to hit Mars too. And there's all these settlements on Mars. What happens if they get hit with this thing and no one's prepared for it? And what happens at the same time that the people in Heavyville, Texas have to deal with the storm? So that was the beginning of a whole story arc. And half of it was like a diptych. Half of it was about the history of the space age from 1962 on to the present to SpaceX, while the other half was about these people on Mars in Arcadia, Polynesia, because I looked up the maps and I said, where are the most likely they're going to be landing sites? So let's set the settlement there. Let's use what we know now. And let's talk about Heavyville, Texas. And let's introduce other characters in the Space Cooperative in headquarters, 3 headquarters in Houston, Nairobi, and Wellington, New Zealand. Because I said, this thing is so large, it needs to have 3 presidents. So I said, made up this whole fiction of a strange new structure that run the Space Cooperative. Because I kept thinking, going back to my first book about the East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, I said, let's call this the East India Company, the first of the interplanetary age. I said, this is like the new power on Earth, and they're going to have these concessions, which allowed me in the next cohort to look at what's going on in crypto. I said, we're going to call this story Coin. The next series will be, there is a financial crisis. And I said, okay, how do they manage the books? The books have gone missing. What do you mean the books have gone missing? I invented a character, the sentient ledger, who has been tasked with overseeing the finances of not only the Space Cooperative, but also a business concession that is not unlike the South Sea Company and the Mississippi Company when they were given the deal to try to manage the debt and exchange the debt for equity. I said, let's just turn this into something where they're managing money. And what kind of money? I'm going to call it the Atlantic coin. It is the Euro dollar 3.0. It is soft power airdropped into the wallets, everyone's wallet across the planet. It's like the Space Cooperative second business, but it's really a powerful business. But now there's a financial crisis because the sentient ledger's gone missing. And there's a whole kind of like financial thriller aspect to it. And so where did he go? He goes into something called the verse. Where's the verse? It's like the net. Instead of the metaverse, it's the verse. So we create a whole story. And he meets someone who's an artist, not a human artist. It's an artist. And so she's going to help him recover his memory, just like in those Hitchcock thrillers. And that leads to the next part, the third of the 4-part arc, Vibe. Because I'm looking at all these artists that I'm following and listening to who are just doing incredible things with NFTs and doing incredible art. I said, okay, let's explore that story. Let's explore the story of art. And we'll at the same time explore this other thriller story of how this ledger is going to deal with his past. And then I find out at the end what happens to him. He recovers his memory. He finds out he's not who he thought he was. And there's all these fun bits where he's in a virtual Parisian apartment. He doesn't recognize anything. It's supposed to be all his stuff. And it's all these clues to who he was. And he goes on the run with the artist to this place, Miami, Marseille. It's in the verse. And there he finds himself. And just as the mysterious people are about to catch him and the artist, he decides to escape one more time to the very beginning of the story, to Harvest, to the 4th and final part of the story, which is the moon. He uploads himself to the moon, to the very south pole of the moon, because right there, according to astronomers from the 19th century, at the very south pole, because it's perpendicular to the plane of the ecliptic, the light that is coming from the sun onto the moon is almost constant. So they call it the eternal peaks of light. So there's a base there, and there's a secret project called the Harvest, right? Because and this is the arc where I get into the myths of the sun and the moon while covering the story of who this guy is. And there's an incredible sentiment inside this giant crater that's right at the very epicenter of the south pole of the moon that's been converted. And there he meets his father, the man who created him. And he turns out he really was a person. So there's a whole kind of thing. I'm telling you because no one's going to be listening to this part. I've lost the studio audience. So it's just you and me talking, so we can talk about it. I can give you all the spoilers. And there I go on a 30-day rampage and I start exploring dialogue and writing. And he's speaking bits of French. He discovers who he really is. And someone from Earth, who is a friend of the first character from the first part of the arc from Terryville, Texas, is sent up there to find out what's going on, to find out what happened to the money. Where's the money? Follow the money all the way up to the moon. And it's a whole bit of intrigue and all the stuff's going on. It's a bit James Bondian, and the story's resolved.
Wow.
And in the meantime, we get to learn about history. We get to learn about history, mythology. We get to explore these ideas. And I get to, I guess, explore my own psyche along the way.
It's funny. I told you before we started to record that I let these chats go where they go. I have a structure, but I immediately leave it. And you've just given me like, I don't know, maybe a dozen things to ask you about.
I don't even know if I have the answers, but I love it because, you know, on the internet, everyone's famous for having the answers. It's really about the questions.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. The questions are vastly more important than the answers. But I'm going to ask you some now, and we'll see what you think. I had originally written before talking with you that you reminded me a lot of William Blake, the English mystic, because of his belief in imagination and how it can create out of our human minds. He's most famous, I think, for his quote: "If the doors of perception were closed,
Yes.
everything would appear to man as it is infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks in his cavern." And yet, as I listen to you, I can't help but think of Proust, in that
Mm.
the quotidian is married to the profound. It sounds like something
They're all
profound.
of a piece.
Yes, exactly. And it sounds like going back to taking care of your father. Um, I had similar situations with my mother at a young age, and not so much with my dad because my sisters were taking care of him. But I remember thinking at the time how one of the things that we had done, I think incorrectly in our modernism, was to remove we living from the dead and or the dying. And I love that you brought your dad back from rehab. We did something similar with my mother-in-law recently, and she sprang back to life. Whereas in rehab, we were certain she was dying because I think she was dying.
I think you did absolutely the most wonderful and right thing because when I was there for those 3 months, he was falling apart and one night during that time, I slept with the phone right next to me, right next to my head. And and it and it turned out to be the thing to do because one night, they called me. He tried to get up from his bed and walk and fell because he no longer had control, I learned later on, over his right leg, right arm. This small tumor that had been growing for years had finally affected his endocrine balance as well as his ability to control his limbs, which I learned about by researching the internet, and I found there was a case. there was a case about something similar to that, and I thought, "Oh, this is what's happened." And when we were in the rehab every day, I would see other people there, and they were just they are you and me, and then something happened, and now it's gone into this totally different direction, that if they were younger, they're going, "How could this happen? How could this happen? How could I end up like this?" If they were in that position, and there was this one poor woman who, uh, she just didn't understand why she was there, and she said, "Can you please call someone so I can go home?" And I was just dying inside. I wanted to do that. I wanted to take her home anywhere, you know? And there's this other woman who didn't remember who I was every day, but I'd bring her the newspaper that after my parents were done reading it, and we'd talk, we'd have the same conversation every day. And I felt something for this poor woman because I remember when the person who does outreach there called me after. I said, "What can I do for you? Can you buy a newspaper for this woman? She lives on this floor in this room for her. Could you please do this for me? There's nothing you can do for me, but there's something you could do for her." And I don't mean to interrupt you, Jim, because I just have to applaud you for doing that because we do not thrive in a vacuum. We do not thrive in isolation, uh, which has a charged meaning if we look back in the last few years. But for ourselves, for our families, you know, it casts in sharp relief what is important and unimportant. That's what I meant by my fears and conceits, all stripped away, by that period, by that time with dad.
The thing that I find fascinating, I agree with you, by the way, that we do not do well in isolation. That's why solitary confinement is often considered the worst punishment, in many regards, even worse than putting someone to death. Because I've read multiple sources on how many of us who are running human OS, if we are isolated, we begin to hallucinate in as little as just a few hours, which really spoke to my idea that we are all sort of the same thing, so to speak. And it is the community and cooperation between people that makes meaning in life. And that was a bit when I was thinking about our separating ourselves from the dead and dying. We stripped away an incredibly vital portion of life, in my opinion, because the cycle of the way we have gone throughout all of human history, not saying it will always be this way, but we're born, we lived, we died. And I'm going to ask you about another one of your stories, which I loved as well, where you talk quite a bit about that. Well, you know what? As I said to you in the beginning, I have a structure, but um, you talk about we all begin life as time billionaires, and you say we begin with a fortune. Not all of us get to spend it. If lucky, loved, laughed, cried, tried, failed, learned, earned, breathed sweet air, that is something that we get to keep. Talk to me a bit about that because I love the way I once wrote in my first book that, and I was speaking specifically about investors, but I think this is applicable to humans. Uh, the I wrote that the best investors had the ability to unstick themselves from time. The past, present, and future make up their now. And I see that in your work as well. Talk to me a bit about that.
It's interesting that you bring, and then thank you for reading it, by the way. I was one of the earliest pieces I wrote when everything was just that was, in January 2020, and that was on my mind a lot, quite a bit, the nature of time, and I was just thinking about it, and I I was just I felt such relief and gratitude that I still have some time, but I felt such shame to regret at not seeing and embracing this a lot earlier, a lot And and it when and displacing it with what I thought was important at the time, long before this. And it is interesting that you talk about about in the investment realm, about the ability to move past the linearity, right? Linearity of time, and to look at a thing, all of a piece, again, back to that phrase. And it's almost like you can imagine this no longer as a line, but as a circle. Forgive the visual reference, but I think that's what we're going towards. And this idea that this is not some disconnected, discrete piece, that this is all interconnected. And one of the most basic structures that does that is a circle versus a line, beginning and end. There is no discrete. There's no demarcation point, right?
Right.
We don't really acknowledge or know that. We we don't necessarily know when we arrive and when we depart necessarily, right?
Right.
So it's almost all the same. And I don't want to get into those hackneyed phrases of living in the now and things like that. But there's this idea that i- if if something like what I went through and many people knew and everyone's gone through, you suddenly are disabused of the notion that you can compartmentalize this into discrete units, if that makes any sense. And so from when I was writing that, I thought, boy, if you can go through all those experiences, that's all there is, isn't there? And you're so very lucky to be granted that, or to experience that, or to go after that. And so I don't envy the people who do certain things in the material realm as much as now as this stuff, the experience part. You can't undo the past, relive the past. You can only rebuild the future with this in mind.
The thing that I found so that resonated with me so deeply with your work is what is part of what you just said, which is the non-linearity of the real life that we live. And we are forever trying to make it linear, make it predictable, make it risk free, if you will. And nothing, of course, is risk free. And when we compartmentalize, we can often lose the thread, so to speak. And I love the way that your work, I don't know if you've read David Mitchell. He's my favorite literary novelist writing today. And he wrote a great book called Cloud Atlas, which if you haven't read,
Oh, I've heard of it. Yes, that's
if
gone on
you
the list. All right, all
yeah,
right.
if you haven't read it, I
Mm.
highly suggest it. I think you'll love it. Because it jumps all over the place. It starts in the present, goes well into the future, goes way into the past, and yet as the novel comes together at the end, you realize that we're all connected across time and space. And much of his work speaks to his sort of obsession with what's now, what's then, sort of along the lines of Einstein's time is an illusion, albeit a persistent one. And what one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, I'm wondering about your background. Like, were you trained as a writer?
No,
And
no.
I thought of Hunter S. Thompson, who
I
who famously typed out the entire book of The Great Gatsby because his reason he gave to people was he wanted to know what it felt like to write a masterpiece. And 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 I love Hunter S. Thompson. Period. I also like Gatsby, although I think some of his stuff is overrated. When he was on, he was really, really on. So not trained as a writer, what in you, was it your imagination? Was it your fascination with going down rabbit holes? I think that's something you and I share in
I
common.
think that I think it might be that. I do. I have written, I have, but not to the degree or extent or depth or and with the disregard for opinion as I have in the last 2 years. I I've written in the past because I went to school like most people go to school and you do those things, but I never thought about it until recently, and then you would do some things for some project or other. My background was the furthest thing. I did not have the wisdom to get an education in that direction. I ended up studying economics and the law, and which just I might as well just gone and learned about history and studied calligraphy and gone traveling around the world and all those other things. You know who I'm talking about,
Yes.
and which reminds me, I wrote this whole piece all in the second person, referring to that person, where the title was "You Do Not Have to Be Perfect," because I thought about that a lot, about the entire life from 1955 on to the end about that, and and um, and so my background, there is no formal training. The All I've got is just practice and writing and just this notion that there's a story, and when I got enough of it written, I said, "I care about these people. They're imaginary, but I care about them. I want to know why, what happened to them, and where did they come from?" Like Casablanca, "Who were you? What were you before?" I
Yeah.
needed to know for myself, for my own gratification, which is the wrong thing to do in the world of the internet. You're supposed to serve. I get it, but I guess I'm serving people who have yet to discover it, and that's okay. In a world of 8 billion people, it's not the true fans, it's the true believers, and they'll find you some way if you put it out there. And yeah, I wish that I had gone to school for those things, but I did not. I just decided to write, and I found the words, or they found me. Let's get corny. They found me, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's like Play-Doh. Maybe it's that's because I've been getting over a cold, so I couldn't really do any work in terms of writing. I spent the whole week just I wanted to read about AI and all this other stuff. I said, "No, let's not do that." So I ended up going to reading about the Royal Society and the Society of Art, and that led me to the Enlightenment, another book, and then that led me to Plato and Aristotle. This weird kind of jets and sharks thing that goes on between these two schools of thought since the beginning of time. And I remember this thing where Plato's like, "Yeah, we have this innate knowing of things." I don't know. I would like to think so. If when things work out, I'd like to say I did it. It wasn't just because I had it, but which then led to yeah, it's just the rabbit holes and just going down that rabbit hole, and then finally in that book about Plato and Socrates, we find out about Charles Sanders Peirce and Ludwig Boltzmann. I said, "Holy cow!" That leads me right back to where I wanted to avoid computers and AI, because those two guys are I feel so bad for them because they had such terrible lives. They were so ignored and discredited and unheralded, and yet it was their strange work which opened the doors to so many other things, and the most recent thing being what's going on now in what was a winter until 10, 15 years ago in neural nets, right? So it's
Yeah.
like boom. So, I'm not a technical guy, but I've just learned this in the last few days. It's like, wow. So, I know it's going to come in some book. All the stuff's going to be feedstock at some point for some story. But for now, it's like I have no formal training except I just like, what's that about? What's that over there? That's it.
That's I think that's delightful. I have written 4 books, but I was never trained as a writer. I like to write. I kept journals since age 18. But I have a different view about schooling. I think our schooling as it presently is deployed worldwide is absolutely in need of an overhaul. And
Mm,
and
yes.
and I think that we've gone from where we are now, where I think people are essentially told, and I'm not going to just blame the educational system.
No.
Let's talk about this as human society.
Mm,
There are 2 ways. Let's really simplify it. There are way more than 2 ways, but let's talk about 2 ways that people think that they're educating others. The first is the most prevalent, which is people tell people what to think, right? Robert Anton Wilson, who's I'm a big fan of, he was way ahead of his time. He called it instilling the correct answer machine in people's brains. Whereas
Yeah.
I think that we are now desperately in need of the ability to teach young people, old people for that matter, how to think, not what to think, because we are going into a far less finite world. I was thinking about it, and like, if you look over almost all of human history, most culture was local. Most people's lives were extremely finite. Many people didn't go more than 5 miles outside of the village they were born in. And so they were born, lived, and died in a mostly agrarian society. And how could they um think great thoughts, right? If they were just surrounded by the same group, the same beliefs, all of those types of things. When you look at it, um there how I wonder, like, how did we come to that? And the way I think about it is, well, we came through it through becoming, right? Heraclitus said everything is always in a state of becoming. And before the industrial
Flux, yeah.
yeah, flux, right. Before the industrial revolution, then this mythical village I'm dreaming up right now, how do you escape the dominant belief or myth of your particular village? And then you think about it, well, who had the best distribution system back then? The church, right? So
Mm.
because they had the only real distribution system that could get into all of these villages, they got into all of the villages, and thus we had this long, long period before the Enlightenment, before the Royal Society was formed, before our breaking off and beginning to ask these questions. But it seems to me to be also part of our evolution as a species. Phil Stutz, who is a psychiatrist that the actor Jonah Hill made a movie about, he had a quote in that movie that I really loved, and I wrote it down. I put it up on Twitter, and it seemed to resonate with people. And I'm not going to do the whole thing, but essentially what he says is true confidence is living in uncertainty. The winner is the one who takes the risk and eats the consequences. What do you think about that?
Oh, yes. I think I heard that passage, and I do know what you're referring to, that documentary, and I think he's spot on. I think he's spot on. This we have this we have s we have this thing called natural intelligence, and beyond that, we have natural imagination and intuition. We have these tools, and the things that people are screaming about right now, that are afraid of, they will augment it. We are not talking about artificial intelligence. We are talking about augmented intuition. We are, at best, we are talking about archived inferences, right? To get into that
Yes.
Charles Sanders thing, because we can do that as humans. We can do the abducted, you know, abduction. I'm getting that wrong, but you understand what I'm saying. I'm not referring to deduction or induction, but that third school of thinking, reasoning, that he was abduction, I think he called it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we can do that part. We can do the best guess part, right? And I love the idea that I want uncertainty, because that means we are not confined to a perfect state that has already been predetermined for us. We do not have the stress of saying, "Is that all there is?" No, that not necessarily. There could be a lot more, and we're just not giving ourselves time and credit to create and fill that space and carve out that space and that uncertainty. We have with what's happening now for a lot of people, we are on the brink, and I hate this sound. It's like a TED Talk thing I'm about to say. We are the verge of infinite agency. Okay? For a lot of people, maybe let's do Pareto, 1.6 out of 8. Those people are lucky. right?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, guys, if you're listening. It sounds so I should put on a black turtleneck and go on a stage and do this thing. But what I'm trying to say is that we
I'll
have the
come.
means.
Edward, I'll come. If you do that, I'll be
Yeah. But what I'm trying to say is that we have the means, and I think what I'm doing now is a very tiny infinitesimal version of that, right? You know, the let's go to Boltzmann, a tiny atom, a particle of a version of this idea that everyone can do this. Uncertainty is great because that means we got room. We can do something with uncertainty. We can do nothing with certainty. That's why I hate perfection. Perfection is 100% tax. You're doomed. If you reach that state, then what? There's nothing left. You're in trouble. It's over. There's only entropy, back to Boltzmann. So, no, we have room. We have the means. Uncertainty gives us the room. If we embrace this infinite agency, boom, we can do things. And look at this, the idea that you see in the financial world when they talk about there's no market for this. What's the use case? What use case? We're creating something out of nothing here. And then suddenly it'll seem so obvious 10, 20, 30 years from now, and your children will take it for granted and they'll forget about it. And that was carved out of uncertainty. So here we go again. I just love this idea that that was brought up in Stutz. I think that is a gift. It didn't feel like that. It sure as heck doesn't feel like that at times. Like how someone's knocking on your door. Where's the rent check? But what I'm trying to say is that that's where the room is for something good to happen. Because if it's already been defined and confined, there's nothing left to refine. Sorry, I just sound like a fight promoter now. But what I'm trying to say now is that yeah, I do the hair thing. But what I'm trying to say is that that is a good thing. I'm jumping for joy with alacrity. You can hear my voice because I didn't understand that before. I didn't. And I'm on the other side of some very bad things. So I can look at the good part of the word uncertainty. It there is the other kind too. The kind where you sleep with the phone next to you and you there's all those things and you don't know what next day each day brings and there's those things happening and you deal. And but then when you don't have that, when you have the privilege of not facing that, uncertainty is a gift.
I I agree completely. I might uh think though that as far as the phone sleeping near your head, when my mom was dying, I recoiled every time my phone rang.
Yeah,
We didn't have cell phones.
I
So
I still do the same thing.
yeah,
When the phone goes, because it was that plus the house plus everything else, it was always something to fix or something has happened.
yeah.
I I I I don't mean to interject, but I remember 2 years ago, it's footnote now, but we went to rehab, the house was broken into and ransacked. How's that for uncertainty? A different kind of uncertainty, and I get a call as my poor brother comes upon it, and they caught the person, then they let them go because, that's what happens. So what I'm trying to say is, yeah, I'm with you about with the phone, and but yeah.
The thing I was gonna interject about the phone though was I don't know that I think of that necessarily as uncertainty. I think
Mhm.
of that as like I knew my mom was gonna die.
Yes.
And so I wasn't uncertain about that. I was
Right.
uncertain about when she would die. And I was incredibly close to my mother. And that's why that the anxiety and the despair
Yeah.
when I heard that phone ring and I would rehearse it in my mind. I was young. I was 28 when my mom died. 20
Oh,
yeah, 28.
oh.
And, um, but the other type of uncertainty that we were speaking more about in terms of, that playground, if you will,
The optionality.
the optionality, I like that. And for our imaginations, for our stories, for our ideas about
Right.
what might come.
When it's not about optimizing, it's about options, optionality.
Exactly, exactly. And and that's another part of your writing that I really, really like so much. It seems to me, I read a lot, and it seems to me that there seems to be kind of a formulaic style of writing, and this is well before Chat GPT, by the way. That is sort of like paint by numbers is the way I think about it. I'm mixing my metaphors there.
But I get your meaning.
But and I really hate it. And like when I see it, it just bums me out, to be honest, because it's kind of like, and that's why I hate the term content. I like
Yeah, that is not a favorite word. Our mutual friend Tom Bevan is the
yes.
pain of our mutual existence.
It's truly, truly, and Thomas gets that exactly right. And these terms of arts that get taken over and just to make yourself known, you end up using because it is the vernacular that everyone is using to describe something that we don't think of the same way. But if you're going to
Right.
get them to think that way, you use their words, and that kind of the tyranny of words that leads into that kind of idea. I hate labels, but this your writing is so the opposite of this. It is so alive in the way that I read it. And I became obsessed with reading your work just because of I just sensed in it the joy of discovery and the joy of creativity, not just discovery, right? Discovery, but then creation. And I kind of think that that's the way these great stories get written, like Cloud Atlas. I don't know whether you've read American Gods by Neil Gaiman.
Oh, that's another one, and
Go ahead.
I I just to think of that makes me feel a little sheepish because I know retrieve. I only have 3 elements in retrieve, and it was all because of Tom Bevan's group. They came up with these monthly symposiums. One was called The Beach. So I wrote an entire piece set in a submarine. I studied I looked online, how do you talk on a sub? So the entire dialogue is all terse language, like in being in a sub.
Uh-huh.
And with the appropriate music I found some from a film at Astra, just to set off the tone of it. And and I remember when I said, "Where am I going with this?" And I said the next chapter was a 3-part intro, prologue, and the next part was set 66 million years ago. And I said, "Well, there was an accident and goodbye dinosaurs," which is their next theme, so I'll probably have to write something for them soon. But because that's their monthly theme, believe it or not, Tom Bevan's people we're madmen. And but it's perfect for me because that's where I'm headed in my story. And the third part is I said I only had one line for the entire thing of Retrieve and the scene of outer space drawn through lexica. I found lexica I drew, I forget. And it was, "Where are the 3 graces?" And so I refer to that because when you talk about American Gods, I said, yeah, I've got this whole thing where I'm going backwards in time. The first 2 books, the book 1 and then book 2 goes backwards. It's the same story, some of the same character last names, but it's backwards, it's closer to us. And now this third one will go further back to begin the story, and it will talk about those things. My own kind of origin story, because the whole thing about myths, I can't stop writing about it. So I'm just going to go in a different direction. I apologize for the interjection and the tangent.
No, that's as I told you before we started recording. And my Olympus here is the movie My Dinner with Andre, which is a marvelous movie that very few younger people have seen. I think it was made in 1981 with the actor that they would probably recognize from Princess Bride, Wallace Shawn, who played Benzini in The Princess Bride, if I recall correctly. Never start a land war in Asia, right? But the I watched that when it came out, and I was young. I think it was done in 1980 or thereabouts, and I was just transfixed because it had this lyrical sort of desultory stepping
Mm.
stone approach to a conversation, and the way it unfolded I just thought was really terrific. um it the reason I brought up American Gods though is because of the mythology tie-in. I think that if for those who haven't read American Gods or seen the TV series, the book is much, much better as usual. But the quick and dirty is that there are the old gods, Odin et al., who are dying, and they're dying because humanity no longer believes in them. And Gaiman makes it's really a wonderful book, um, because it becomes a battle between the old gods, Odin, etc., and the new gods, media, computers, etc. And he essentially sets up a world in which everything really is born of human belief, and those myths get written and adopted, kind of like Jung's idea of ideas. Humans don't have ideas; ideas have humans, and I just see a lot of that in the structure of your work as well. But I also see I just finished a book by David Shields called Reality Hunger. And he's an essayist who spends the majority of the book deriding what novels have become. And but another thing made me kind of think of you. He quotes Emerson in the book, and Emerson said he was looking for a new type of work, writing, literature, I think Emerson called it. And he called it after a device that was popular during his time, which proved to be a hoax, by the way, which I think is charming because you'll see in a minute. Emerson said he wanted the new literature to be a panharmonicon. And by that, and I'm quoting Emerson here, everything is admissible: philosophy, ethics, poetry, humor, fun, mimicry, jokes, as against the certainties of the older novel structure that kind of got put in place in the early 19th century, where science, right? The world was certain. We lived in a clockwork universe. Everything was deterministic. Everything was known. And therefore, humans organized their lives around that, of course, having no idea of our quantum future. Do you like where do you get your inspiration from? Just is it from life? Is it found art? The part with your father, and you're going through his things, right? Those were real things and they sparked real thoughts, but then you use them as a jump off into this wonderfully mythical imaginary world. Di- is there a process that you know about, or is it just springing?
I wish it was structured. I wish it was something that was by design, like, what's the, you heard of what's it called? Oulipo?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wish it was something so I wish it was designed, it was architected or whatever you would call it. I wish it was, so deliberate. It was those 30 days, those first 30 days in 2-1 text, 2x21, just writing, trying to figure out a story where I begin sort of in the middle or near the end, I realize, and then I go work my way backwards and then forwards. There was no, as I said, I had no formal training. It was just the sheer idea, and also it was just the gratitude of having some people reach out to me in those first few pieces and tell me they liked these ideas that I was just putting out there, riffing. That's my favorite verb for it, riffing. And their reaction was so moving to me, touching, that someone would take time to tell me that they enjoyed it and that it meant something to them. And that's what kept me going. And sometimes every time I do a cohort, I meet someone and they say, "Oh, I'm reading this along." And there's other creators who are doing well in their fields, and they would read some of these things along. As this is what keeps me going. So maybe it is a belief that feeds me, keeps you alive. It's someone paying attention, one person reading along for 30 days on the long, lonely road to that valley, and said, "Okay, I can keep going to the other end of this thing." I wish I had a process. There is no outline to speak of except what was created in those first 30 days, or what was in my head when I started, the book that became Harvest, that second book, that JFK speech. It was just I wanted to, I guess I had enough practice that I had an internal idea, "Okay, I'm gonna start with this one thing and focus on this one area of history and mythology, and then write this other thing about these characters and figure out where I wanna go or what question I wanted to ask." Like Carrington, the coronal mass ejection. Let's bump it up. And what happens? What if? And I had no idea that I was going to write about a sentient ledger and an Atlantic coin, or about an autonomous artist in the verse, or about Miami, Marseille. I just wanted to. I was having fun because by then I was like, okay, they're gonna escape, and how they're gonna jump in the verse on a virtual Riva boat. Those beautiful Italian speedboats, and they're gonna go off like in a movie. I had a soundtrack in my mind. I said, let's pretend this is a movie, and I'm writing these scenes. And I said, okay, it's the guy and the girl in the Riva in the virtual world, and they're about to go to Miami, Marseille, because those are two water-based cities where underworld things happen. I said, let's figure out what
So
happens.
so that leads me to another thing I think I thought about you, and it's
Yeah.
wonderful that this is just happening naturally. Your writing is also quite cinematic, and I think, and you talk about Marseille and uh that being the sort of the water, and of course I immediately am thinking of Christopher Nolan, right? I don't know if you're a fan of his work. I am.
Oh yeah.
Um
There has to be an influence, because what are we but children of the media of our times, whatever it is. And I imagine that that is an influence, but it was not deliberate. But I do tell you, at times when I would make a soundtrack, I would hear tunes randomly. I said, "Oh, it's this person, or it's this place," and I'd add it to the soundtrack. And so, yeah, there is some visual landscape that's unfolding in my mind as I'm writing. It's not on purpose. It's not by design. It's almost kind of like those books, like, "What happens here? Turn to this page," or something like that.
Create your own adventure.
Some
I I
version of that.
I write fiction kind of as a hobby, and,
Mm.
I had this one that I just found in an old journal. I'd completely forgotten about it. And it began as, a man and his wife were at a party here in Manhattan, and suddenly it went nonlinear.
That's awesome.
In other words, they were having the normal boring, "So how are you? How are things?" All of the things that we really, these are just filler phrases, and we're not communicating really, in my opinion. We're almost robotic in, "What do you do? Oh, and you must like that." Anyway, he
It's
starts
domestic content.
yeah. Yes. So suddenly he starts shouting in ancient Chinese at someone he sees across the room. And
Right. Now
that
you've got the non sequitur. What just
yeah,
happened?
and that character suddenly, immediately you witness him change and his face changes. And these two people hate each other, and they begin to run right at each other to attack one another, and they end up going out a window, and they're having this huge battle, and they're shouting ancient Chinese. Of course, no one knows this. Someone's recording it. We didn't have cell phones when I wrote this, so somebody had a tape recorder. But I like those kinds of ideas, and that had a whole the storyline there was, we were constantly reborn, and some of us kept our memories from our previous life, and these were two who'd been fighting each other over all of the sands of time. Um but it's like, do you have, because again we're getting back to a bit of the myth. Does are our myths, the ones we're writing now, are we writing enough of them? I'm very taken by your idea about Kennedy saying, "You know what? We're going to the moon." And Robert Persig, who wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, had another thing where he said, "Listen, everything you see comes out of the minds of men and women. There is no steel in nature. That came out of our minds." And like, I was in Africa once, and I had this feeling of like I was looking at something that really didn't come out of our human minds. And then and I was having, my little moment saying, "Oh, and this is what it really looked like," and everything. And then of course my guide disabused me of that. telling me how oh, no, no, no. No, all of that, even though it appears wild right now in the Serengeti, that was much of that tended by human husbandry. My point being is, where does your material spring from?
Oh, the feedstock?
Yeah.
I would imagine it's the same as everyone else. It's our common knowledge. It's the whole sorry, Ben Hunt. It's the whole it's the whole things that our common language that we all share in terms of the media, in terms of our entertainment, our literature, uh, it our discourse, right? And any particular interest that I have, I have a fascination for history. Not everyone loves it, but history and mythology. There's this idea I think about memory. I think when it comes to stories, it's the people talk about the long game. For me, I am captivated by the long meme.
Yeah.
Okay, and I feel like it's almost like that cool setting for that story. It's like this scene of domesticity, and then that which provides a great sharp contrast for what happens right after that. That's what's great about the opening. You don't see that coming, and also what just happened, right? It's like the Matrix when it begins this way, what just happened? And
Yeah.
that's what you wanna see happen. You wanna see that tension. Uh, so for me, it's the common language of our entertainments and our experiences from our time. It's, Steven Johnson, speaking of novels, Steven Johnson had this interesting chart of novelistic genres and trends, and they seem to last coincidentally about the length of a generation, roughly 20, 25 years.
Mhm.
And the styles would change over time in terms of the novel, right? What was the popular novel at the time? And I suppose there's some truth to that for me. It's not in a vacuum. There's all the stuff that's happened that we grew up with when we talk about film, when we talk about music. So I suppose that there is some inspiration for that. For me, it's just my particular mixture of that. When I go to the buffet table, I'm going to get certain things more than others when I put it together on the plate than someone else. But it's all from the same source, isn't it?
Pretty much. In many respects, I think that, um, one of the things that you let happen in your writing, and I think it's why it appeals to me so much, is that I'm a fan of what's called found art. Um,
Oh,
we
yeah.
we collected a painter who is British, and she literally we she was unknown when we first bought her work, so she was quite reasonably priced. But it turned out, so we bought the entire collection, and it was like 14 pieces that were on offer. And when we spoke to her, first off, I got a call from the artist, um, and had been given my number by the dealer, and she was literally crying. And it turned out, when I heard her story, she had not been successful as an artist and had to keep a job. And my buying, for again a very reasonable amount of money, her entire uh, collection that was on offer, but from the dealer, let her quit her job, right? And and it was wonderful because she told me all about how, no, those, I asked her about one of the pieces. Some were in black and white, some were in color, and I was asking her about the woman featured in one. I asked, "Was that your mother?" And she goes, "No, that was a magazine cover that I found and drew over." But then she said, "But in a way, I turned her into my mother." And
Yeah.
you've said that, you know you seem to me to be incredibly open to the random, to accident, to serendipity. Um, and was that a result too of the kind of letting go after you had this very emotional and yet um, meaningful experience, tending to your father, tending to his things after he'd gone? Was that the kind of strip away? Because you have another story basically about the snowball and the avalanche, right?
Uh,
And I was fascinated by that because the snowball is what everyone is given, their life advice, right? Meaning,
right.
be modest, have a good habits, be persistent. But much of life, like for example, many of the great discoveries over in quantum physics in particular and formulas were really like quantum leaps, avalanches, as
Yes.
you put it, explosions of change, and those require adaptability and resilience. Talk to me about that, because I definitely see that in your work.
Oh, that's so I all I can say is at the time when I was writing the first early pieces, I was just kind of finding my way through writing about time and then later on space in every meaning of the word. It was the reactions of the readers, the friends that I was making that gave me a little bit of a nudge to go further. I did honestly did not know how much I would write or if I'd write anything at all. But it was just enough to know that I was there and that it meant something, that it registered. And I decided to, I guess, indulge in what I was visualizing because as you have alluded to, there's a visual. I guess there is a visual. There's a strong visual component to what's going on when I write. Uh, and so I began to see and hear things. Some of it was music, so that's why you get those Spotify playlists for so many of these collections made for each of these pieces. I would hear things or see things, and I said, "Okay, we're going to turn that into something because I can have a feeling for a character or a scene from what I'm hearing or what I'm seeing." Uh, I suppose, yeah, there is a bit of a found element. I would make preview images. You've seen them
Mhm.
where and the mood board, each of those was a component where I'd say, okay, 1961, I would find black and white pictures of the Wall and things like that, and I would create a collage image and of that, what's the name of that Italian actor who, did Le Samurai? I said, "That's it. That's the picture for me of 1961." And so, yeah, there is a bit of a found art element to it, the visual, and I did the same with each of those. I would create those images just before I'd write. Like, the first one was just Neil Armstrong's suit
Huh.
on a museum. I said, "That's a powerful image," right?
Yeah.
And I said, "That's enough for me to work with right there." And I would do that likewise, and it's just I suppose there is that. I would see some images, that's enough for me to retrieve. I was writing some of the piece, I said, "Create a field for me of stars." I think I was going through Lexica to do it, and I said, "This is it. I have enough here." There's a scene of the stars, there's a scene of the sun or of a star. I said, "This some feels something grand and ancient at the same time." I said, "That's just enough for me to go on." And the line, "Where are the three graces?" Because I kept thinking about the ancient past, the really ancient past. And that was just enough. That was just enough. A one line, one image, a sound.
And you also write quite a bit about the future, right? You wrote a piece called "Looking Back from the Future," which
Mhm.
think of Edward Bellamy's "Looking Backward,"
Oh, yeah.
which was a utopian novel for those who don't know Edward Bellamy's work. The full title of the novel was "Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887," and it was essentially a story of a uh, a young man. The protagonist, Julian West, falls asleep in the late 19th century, and he wakes up in the year 2000 in America. America is a socialist utopia, and it sold millions and millions of copies, and they formed societies around this. And, he got it wrong, but he got a lot of stuff right. In other words, so he bought things from cooperatives where the middleman was taken out. Well, Costco, Sam's Warehouse,
Right.
Amazon. He
Yeah.
he he got sermons and music being available through cable telephone. Well, that's radio and the telephone. But what did you learn when you wrote your "Looking Back from the Future"?
How, wow, how much, how, oh, how l what really mattered was not as much as I would have thought at the time. It's much smaller,
Mhm.
right? And I don't wanna use that word essentialism. I don't wanna talk about things like that and say Marie Kondo. I simply want to say that, I don't wanna be reductionist. I don't wanna get into that. I'm not coming off as an ascetic. I'm simply saying that there's a filter there. It's a useful tool as a filter, right? I don't know if it's regret minimization like you've heard, but it's more like what is it that matters actually? And that's the stuff that registers when you put pen to paper, when you put your fingers on the keyboard. And the rest is just kind of all the things we worry about, those are the details. And they're not to be really worried about. They're gonna happen or they're not gonna happen. I don't know. I don't carry around a coin. We all have a coin of the mind. We don't need to be reminded of that one, right?
Right.
Memento mori, we don't need that. We go through enough life, we can carry a coin in the mind. We don't need to shut ourselves away from other people. We have a cabin in the mind. We can work with what we had in front of us here. And that's what I would say that's what I carry from that.
And
Privately, when I think about that.
yeah, when you talk about we're all the children of Daedalus, um,
Oh,
the future is fashioned by hand. Our stories are messages to the future. Wilson called that time binding. So my question there is, which by the way, I 100% agree with you. I do believe that our stories and our myths, if you will, like Kennedy saying, "We're going to the fucking moon." Well, Mr. President, we have no way of doing that. And yet you found that story from I can't what remember 1916.
right.
Uh that was sort of the origin story of that. And then of course you can go beyond that and say
Mhm.
Wells and you can go all the way back to the pre-Socratic philosophers like Heraclitus,
Yes.
anticipating Taoism and modern physics, if you will. Um, and uh, and that's what I love about this. I think we should do more of this, not less. And you are doing more, which is one of the other reasons I love reading you. But how do we avoid becoming Icarus?
I would say, and it's kinda weird because I think I see 2 trends. I see a lot of fiction and see a lot of reaching for utopian fiction or what we call utopian fiction. I would say dystopia is kinda like a little bit of that is like a little bit of the bad stuff, a little bit of the poison, a little bit of the vaccine that
Homeopathic.
drives us towards utopia.
Yeah.
I'm not saying everything's Mad Max. I'm simply saying we do those things to remind ourselves of what we don't want.
Yeah. That's a good, that's a,
Cautionary tale at least, at minimum. But also, it's just that part of our hardwiring because most of mankind has not always had it so good. So unfortunately, the things that's just a reminder. Maybe that's part of our chemistry too. We need a little bit of that adrenaline, right?
I like that distinction because like if you've read any of Rene Girard, like
Mm, mm,
mimetic theory, the thing that bums me out about him is like I get it, and I read about mimetic theory not to be distinguished or not to be confused with
mm,
mimetic,
right.
what Dawkins banged on about. But mimetic, which is essentially copying others, copying their hopes and dreams and making them our own. But he always ended up like he was so apocalyptic, and it was when I read him and read people writing about him, it's just like we fear our own human nature. We're going to become way too powerful, and that's going to create our ruin. And that's your what you just mentioned, right? It's our cautionary tale. I think sometimes that takes over, if you
Right.
will.
It can eclipse our pursuit. Let's use this in this field of thick desires. The thing, would you love doing this thing or this thing or this place or this person, even if no one else loved it?
Right.
That hobby, that pursuit, right? Who do you model for the thick desire, right? It can eclipse that and it should not. I think if I'm reading your question correctly or you're framing correctly your concern accurately, that that is can that get in the way of doing that? And I yeah, we see a lot. Look at Instagram. Holy cow. So, you know, I that's a different kind of thought leader. That's they took a few letters out of that word. But anyway, uh, you know, I I I I think to connect it back to what's driving me with the writing, I think, yeah, I found my thick desire by accident. It wasn't by master plan. It was just through this having this space to do something different than what I was doing for 2.5 years. It was something unexpected, and I just grabbed on, and I
Which
found this.
which I find wonderful. You also talk about the need for having an editor. Um, and I was lucky. As I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, I've written 4
Mhm,
books, and
mhm.
I was lucky because my wife graduated summa cum laude in journalism,
Oh,
and
wow.
so I had a built-in editor. I was ridiculously lucky. And she fixed it, and I remember, and I wonder if you had the same experience. Um, when she first began tearing my manuscript apart and killing my darlings, I was really angry. And we got into like a killer fight. We were taking a train into the New York City. And like it was me saying, I was really mad and she was just shooting back at me. And of course, she made what I was writing vastly better. And I accepted that. Did you go through anything like
No,
that?
I have not had an editor, but I'll tell you what I've done since I stopped when I finished book number 2 in November, right 2 days before Thanksgiving, I gave myself, "I must finish this." And then I put it down for a little while, and then I picked up book number 1, and I said, "It's on Scrivener. Let's do this." And I started going through it. I said, "That's gone. That's gone." I was, like, feeling good. I felt like I got a meat cleaver here. It felt so good to kill the Buddha, to chop away at this thing. I said, "That's exposition. I don't need this. That's gone. Let's add some dialogue here," because book 2 was more dialogue. I said, "Oh, let's play with this now." With it, it was another round of, "I'm gonna have fun with this. Let's add dialogue here. This is the do-over that you can't do in real life. You can do this in a written work. You can do over. You can you can get the girl. You can go see about a girl, right? You can it'll happen, right? You know what I mean?
I do. I know
It comes
exactly.
together because you did the work. You chop this thing out. You remove this. You rewrite this entire passage. You come up with, "Oh, that's the thing." Because the first book had a MacGuffin. That's the box of stars is the allusion to the MacGuffin,
Yeah.
which is I called it in the very first one of the first pieces, I called it the manifold. It's this thing, but I don't describe it. I just use the word, and it's the scientist Cadmus, whose name I got from Greek myths, the inventor of the alphabet. He's a great mind who gets kicked out of school in the 1976 series, but he creates the manifold, and I come up with a reason to say why does everything happen? It's because of this thing. But I wouldn't have gotten that if I wasn't willing to go in and let's chop away and go back. Aha, here it is. Through the thicket of chopping away at these little like vines of my ego to get to this thing that I really needed that really served the story. And that felt really good. That was cathartic to just like, oh, okay, this is where we're going. And it felt good to chop away exposition because I said, even I'm sick of reminding myself of the same thing over and over and over. Let's get rid of this stuff here. That
It's
felt good. And so I don't have an editor because for financial reasons, I have a loved one who really needs the help, and whoop, editor money's gone. So I'm going to do this, and I'm okay with that because I'm not looking forward to. I remember listening to Murakami's autobiography, which was inspirational to me. How he had these secret kind of dog fights with his editor. Maybe not as bad as yours on the train on the way to the city, but it was pretty rough for him. And and he's a pro, right? Just like you. And so I guess I'm gonna be looking at myself in the mirror, castigating myself. That'll be how I do my inner monologue will be a fight, right? It
that's
won't be Plato's dialogues. It's just to be an argument, a knockdown, drag out fight. Who
that's
knows what'll
great
happen? But yeah,
because
you gotta have fun with this because I in the long run, it won't matter. Who cares? What matters is, and I'm gonna say these 3 things. I'll say 3 things at the end of our talk that I think are the ultimate message to me as a reminder and to everyone else. But I'll say it now. I did my best. I gave my all. I was here,
I love it. I mean,
right? Well, let's put that in Latin. That sounds pretty good.
it would sound good in I had 6 years of Latin, and all it really taught me was, how to get to the origin or derivation of English.
Yeah, same thing with me. That part that made the SAT easy. Yeah,
It really did, so it really did serve its purpose.
yeah.
Well, the last thing I wanted to cover is something that's near and dear to my heart and that you've, talked about quite a bit, which is generative AI. Um, and you've talked about and look at it, I think, in much the same way I do, at least directionally. In terms of it is going to allow us to unlock doors that have been barred to us. I'm paraphrasing you here. And let us tap into rich veins for an embarrassment of rides of the mind. And I think that was you because it's elegant and lyrical. Uh, talk about that for a bit. How
I
is
have to say
gener
when I saw those what was being released, I was like, "What just happened?" And to me, I because of book 1, when I was writing a lot of the stuff I was writing about in one sequence in the 1987 series, I wrote about how people, the birth of the internet, it was a monochromatic text landscape, right? And
Yeah,
people were soon going to be granted new bicycles, right? Bicycles of the mind to go off-roading outside of the manicured walled gardens. And what were they at the time? CompuServe, AOL, stuff like that, right?
yeah.
And when I saw this, I said, something's happening here.
Mm,
A new bicycle of the mind is being assembled. I know that there are issues. I understand that. But if we can get a little Chris Dixon here, read, write, own, right? We
yeah.
want we want dominance of a market. We want prominence for our work. Well, we shall need provenance for it too. And what is going to happen with that other currently not quite down at the heels, but somewhat challenged field is this idea of provenance, right?
Mhm.
Proof of non provenance. It all rhymes. And when we combine that with this, when you create your work, you'll be rewarded for it because it's about this idea of natural imagination, augmented intuition. It is about archived inferences that we make. Our work, our humanity is the thing that we can get rewarded for now. With these tools, it will take time. There's a lot of landmines here. There's a lot of issues here. I get that as I'm reading through the papers. And it will seem, to paraphrase from Hobbes, more dreams than science. But I think we are headed in a direction where people will be rewarded for being a human in ways they didn't expect. I know right now it looks bad, and I know I've seen it. I've seen it on Twitter. I've seen all that stuff. But I believe from looking at history, from looking at the papers, the early papers, the history of the cypherpunks, I see this kind of repeating itself in this arena too for people, these new tools, these new bicycles of the mind. And it's going to be just something, nothing less than remarkable when it's rolled out for people. They're going to have these tools. The UX will get better. The tooling will get better on both the rails, right? The financial rails, but also for the building and creating and making and sharing and putting things out there. We will get past the Carlotta Perez part of the market where there's the rugging and there's the disappointment and all of that stuff. We're going to get to the next phase when we may very well end up taking for granted things running in the background, but they are running in the background on our behalf. That is what I'm excited about here, right? And the tools and text, it's kind of amusing. It's funny. You read the Stefan Wolfram stuff about the
Yep,
limitations, right, of the attention model,
yep,
but there's something to be said for combining that super fast, shape shifting statistical stencils in that space with his work on symbols, right? On information through symbols, because he's a mathematician with Wolfram research. I'd say that there's something there too, and it's going to come together. So right now, They're playing with it. They're putting the Gumroad links out there. They're selling it. But the next generation is going to be all these incredible tools that will build upon transposition, transcription, translation, to use the AI word transformation, right? Transformers. I'm very excited. If you can hear my voice, it's because I think it's coming, but it's not going to be smooth, but it is coming. The merger of these two weird fields that Venkatesh Rao talked about, that Peter Thiel was cautionary about, saying one field was communist and one was liberal. Well, that almost sounds like Plato, right? Community property and Aristotle. We're bringing them back here, right? We're closing up with those guys again. So I say to you that these models, that this is going to be nothing less than remarkable.
Amen. Preach, brother. I agree with everything you just said. And the part that you said that I always try to repeat because I'm talking my book here. I'm the chairman of Stability AI, which is a truly open source AI platform foundational model company. And the part that you said that is there's going to be a lot of fuck ups, and we're going to have a lot of mistakes, and we're going to have to we're going to have a lot of stuff to figure out, but it's worth it because we are now going to be able to use these incredible tools. And I love the way you put it. They're there on behalf of us. They are there for us. People confuse the technology with the use of the technology. We are the humans using that technology to extend our imagination, to extend our reach. And like, that's the part of this that I find so incredibly exciting. And it seems you do as well. I just think we're going to be able to look into liminal spaces where simply because of the speed of computation, these programs are going to be able to look where we can't look right now, but we'll learn how to incorporate those findings into our own imaginations, into our own extension of our stories. And so I am incredibly excited. Well, cautious about all the things that we're going to have to overcome, right? I mean, it's like fire, right? Man discovered fire, and guess what happened? We cooked our food and we created the prefrontal cortex, and lots of great stuff happened. But lots of really shitty stuff happened too. That you realize that you could burn homes, you could burn people, you could burn cities. And so we didn't outlaw fire. We created fire departments. We created fire alarms. We created fire extinguishers. We created fire doors and warnings. And a lot of that is going to go on in the extension of these models. The thing that I passionately believe, and which is why I invested in an open source company as opposed to a closed source, is I believe that this must be open source for a lot of reasons. Some of them having to do with creating better models. If you have cognitive diversity, you're going to get to better models because people think differently and we live in different reality tunnels and all of that.
We
But
can
also,
benefit from combinatorial diversity.
exactly. But also because I do not want my grandchildren, I currently have four, we're expecting a fifth. I do not want my grandchildren to grow up controlled by a panopticon, controlled by a few people. And I believe that discovery, all of these tools will only see their greatest fruition if they are made available to all of us, because I don't know your creative skills through and through. You don't know mine. I don't know, what some artist might do with this or what a scientist, you mentioned Wolfram. I have no idea. So the ability to have these generative new ideas, these new creations, it's got to be open. And I fear, we saw what happened. Like, the early social media sites in AI speak, they maximize the objective function for revenue. And I always ask, well, why don't we maximize the objective function for human happiness or creativity or imagination. We can.
We can't optimize for creative facility.
And I think that's what we need to do. And I think that is what is happening. But yeah, there's going to be a lot of rancor along the way because we're going to get back to this idea of getting on the other side of perfection. Perfection doesn't exist. It's a chimera, in my opinion. And if you're forever trying to be perfect, you'll really create nothing. And Kafka, he wanted all of his work burned when he died, and that was because he felt that it was crap, it was shit, it wasn't perfect. And thank God people interceded and made sure that his work did get published. um I guess final
Yeah.
thoughts. What are you um what's next after you're done with your next novel?
I I know that I will be editing books 1 and 2. I will look forward. I'm eager to write book 3, Retrieve, which was a title drawn from all these technical terms about computing, and, uh, I look forward to continuing writing. I look forward to making more acquaintances and friendships in this space. Will I ever find the 100 true fanatics? We'll see, you know,
Well,
or true believers.
I can tell you
Uh,
one thing, Edward. I will do my best to amplify you to those
uh,
true fanatics
but
because
I also want to make sure that other people are doing likewise too. I want them to do the thing they care about.
exactly.
I love that line from *Halt and Catch Fire*. Computers aren't the thing, it's the thing that gets you to the thing.
Yeah.
These are instrumentalities for ourselves, for our fulfillment for the time we have. And I'm grateful that I made a choice for this and that I'm doing my best. And I repeat the 3 lines. I did my best. I gave my all. I was here. That'll be my final message for this conversation, but also for my life.
I love it. Well, we have a vertical called Infinite Films, and I definitely will be getting in touch with you at some point when that comes online. Because I think that I would love just to see I would love to see your incredible imagination, your lyricism and poetic style come to life in as many different formats as it can, as long as it can be done well. Um,
I just love it because I think that's the big part of what I write. This is a base layer. It can be rendered into anything. That's
yeah,
what I realized from looking at everything. It doesn't matter what I can master in terms of the tools. There are new tools coming. There are new studios emerging. This is what this is. This is the rise of the one man, one woman, one person studio with these tools.
yes, and I'm just think it's going to be an incredibly exciting period, not without difficulty, but exciting and kind of we've named it perfectly, generative. We are going to unleash billions of generative imaginations, which I just think is such a fantastic thing, which is why I'm so excited about it. Well, at the end of all of my podcasts, I invoking Inception, I guess. I say that we're going to make you the emperor of the world for one day. You can't kill anyone. You can't re-educate anyone. You can't do anything harsh or force anyone to do anything. What you can do, however, is take a magic microphone and speak two things into it. And whenever the next morning is for wherever our fellow humans are waking up, they're going to wake up. And each of those two things that you spoke into the magic microphone, they're going to think they thought of or had a dream about. And they're going to say, you know what? I'm going to start doing both of those right now. What do you got for me? What are you going to incept?
Believe in yourself. Believe in others.
Mm, perfect. I love it. Listen, Edward, this has been so much fun. I can't wait to see the rest of your work. I love your work. I think it's really, really fresh and great, and it just really makes me happy to see such creativity. And when I find it, I just I tend to go on and on. And this has been a wonderful conversation. Where can people find you online? I know we can find you on Twitter, and you have your Substack, but any other locations where people see you?
The entirety of everything I've written is on Mirror,
Okay,
which is also edwardrooster.eth, but you can probably find me on Substack primarily, as well as TypeShare under Edward Rooster. Everything's Edward Rooster.
perfect.
That wasn't by design, it was just because I'm lazy.
Well, you and I are also very simpatico there. I am extraordinarily lazy, but that makes it easy for us because we always try to find the easiest way to do something. So thus we have O'Shaughnessy Ventures because it was easy and I'm lazy. Listen, this has been a true treat for me. Thank you for taking the time. And I hope if you're ever in New York, don't be shy. Please uh, get in touch, and I'd love to buy you lunch or dinner.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure and honor.
Oh, the honor was mine. Thanks, Ed.